Hello and welcome back to another short presentation. My name is Dr. Rizwan Mustafa, and in today's short session I'd like to talk to you about the publication Dabiq and the relevance of its name. So let's jump straight into it. Now, what is Dabiq? Dabiq literally is a small town approximately 35 kilometers to the northeast of Aleppo in Syria. Now, if you can see the map here, there is a town highlighted towards the bottom, Aleppo, and if you look north of that, roughly at about 1 o'clock, you see a short piece highlighted, small mass of land highlighted, and that is the town of Dabiq. So literally that's what Dabiq is. It is a geographical place in modern day Syria. But Dabiq also has a theological and eschatological connotation as the town that we understand it to be. It is referenced in prophetic narrations and it speaks of the place from which an army will be dispatched in order to meet an emerging threat. Now, the narration itself is communicated through a hadith, and for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the terminology, there is a really useful glossary of terms that we've uploaded onto the resource website or into the resource space on our website, which you can have a look at to understand what hadith means. But essentially it's a compilation of narrations by various authors of what the Prophet, peace be upon him, has said, done, and silently approved. And in this particular narration, this is a snippet from the hadith narration that talks about the town of Dabiq. He mentions لا تقوم الساعة حتى ينزل الروم بالأعماق أو دابق فيخرج إليهم جيش من المدينة من خيار أهل الأرض يومئذ. And it translates as the hour will not be established until Rome descends upon A'maq or Dabiq. Now, there is a conversation amongst the scholars of narration around what this means, A'maq or Dabiq. Some people say that it's two different towns. Some people say that it's the same town with interchangeable names. But Daesh have gone with the understanding or preferred the name Dabiq over A'maq as the reference point for this town. And then the translation goes on to say, an army will dispatch from this town, meaning the town of Dabiq, in response to the Romans. And this is a snippet of a broader narration that mentions Dabiq and mentions what's referred to as Rum in Arabic. And that's not necessarily the Romans as we understand them in the geographical land today, but it was a historical reference term for the broader empire of Christendom, which was centralized in Rome, but it had a huge land mass. So they were referred to as the Rum. And the kind of historical term that's being used here, translated means Romans, but it's bigger than the geographical boundary of Rome. It is a reference point to anybody who shares the ideology of Christendom historically understood, and in the contemporary sense, the way that organizations, faith organizations like Daesh interpret it to be is anybody who's essentially non-Muslim, the Christians, the Jews, as you often hear in pejorative loaded language in their publications, and anybody else who is supportive of their worldview as it's positioned. So the Romans, even though it's been translated here, has a broader context and a broader understanding. But the narration goes on to say that they meaning that the people that meet the Romans in battle, they will be the best of those who roam the earth at that time. So you can see how Dabiq or Daesh have positioned their name of their publication as a reference point of a town that has eschatological associations, that this town will be almost the battleground for one of the apocalyptic battles that is to come towards the end of days, because the Prophet, peace be upon him, here is talking about the end of days. He's talking about establishment of the hour, the day of judgment, and the day of judgment will not come until this battle lands at the doorstep of Dabiq. And when it lands at the doorstep of Dabiq, there'll be a group of people who respond to that threat, and they will be the greatest people on the earth at that time. So Daesh have labeled their publication as a synonymous with this town, and also presenting themselves as the best of those people who are on the earth at this moment in time. Now, one of the interesting things about this publication is that the narration itself, this snippet of this narration, and bearing in mind that the prophetic narrations need to be positioned and contextualized amongst the broader theological imperative of faith and everything else that feeds into it. You can't just take a line and a half of a narration and hope to understand the entire series of events that will unfold, and what indeed is permissible and what isn't impermissible, what is impermissible. So there's a broader context and conversation to be understood here. But that aside, the interesting thing about this, about the way that Daesh have positioned themselves and labeled their publication, is the fact that this narration, or this snippet of this narration, talks about conflict. It talks about the end of day. It's eschatological. It talks about the day of judgment, and it talks about those folks who respond to that emerging threat as the best people in the earth at that time. And this is synonymous with how they communicate, how they position themselves as, you know, the group of individuals who are only the ones that are responding to the emerging threat, and nobody else is. We're the true Muslims as they position themselves. But it also relates to how Dabiq, as a publication, positions its theological worldview in terms of how to attain success and how to attain God's pleasure. And this leads into one of the other videos that we've uploaded onto the resource space, talking about the militant faith proposition. So if you haven't watched the militant faith proposition video, I'd really encourage you folks to watch that, because it really supports this video to give you a better understanding of how the faith proposition is constructed for those who are of faith background, so faith alleged terrorism and extremism backgrounds, and how that ideology underpins the way that Dabiq have presented their ideology in this publication, and how they instruct their followers and adherents down a very particular course of action. So the Dabiq in and of itself, as a publication, is a reference point to a town, and that town in and of itself has eschatological narrations. It has eschatological connotations. So when you look at the publication, you can see that even at this moment in time, you know, in 2014, 2015, when they were authoring and writing this, they were looking way down the line, in the sense that, you know, we don't want to be here forever. We're not going to, you know, establish our caliphate as something that we want forever. Rather, our endeavors and our efforts are to bring about the apocalyptic end, because that is what the narration talks about. So responding to the Roman threat, responding to the threat of Rome as it's understood in the narration, is actually a response by the folks of Daesh, whatever you want to refer to them as, or however you want to refer to them as an eschatological response, in the sense that, you know, we're acting now, and we fully understand that our response in this space will perhaps lead to our destruction and the destruction of the caliphate. And you know what? We're okay with that. So the mindset is already there, that even in their seeming defeat, there is victory for them. And that's really, really profound. That's really profound, because this is a broader narration. It talks about other things, and if we get time in another video, perhaps we'll talk about that. But in and of itself, Dabiq is that. Yeah, so that's what Dabiq is. Now, when we look at the focus of Dabiq, having understood the relevance of the town, having understood the eschatological connotations, what is its main publication focus? What is it actually pushing individuals towards? Well, it seems kind of evident from the way that the individuals act, the way that they behave, the way that they actually want to position themselves. I mean, you can see some of the publications here. The Failed Crusade. The language in and of itself, and that's a separate conversation, but the language in and of itself is written in the 21st century, but there's strong 7th century underpinnings and connotations in terms of how it's been written, how it's been communicated, how it positions the world at large itself. The focus, however, is on violence, inherent violence. And as you look through the publication, and I've read all 950 odd pages of it, close to 1,000 pages, 15 volumes, you can begin to see the amount of focus that the publication has on things like violence and things like killing. So if we look at this warfare section here, the warfare section, which contains things like killing, death, fighting, martyrdom, jihad, as you know, we had a brief discussion about that in the other video regarding faith, militant faith proposition, what jihad is. But in this context, it's understood to mean the use of violence and the use of force. Ribat, which is known as a preparatory act or a safeguarding act, which is subsumed within the rubric of jihad. And then you also have the killing of Copts. All of this is to do with death. All of this is to do with fighting. All of this is to do with violence. But it takes up 43% of Dabiq's thematic focus in how they suppose and how they communicate to earn God's pleasure. So when you look at the publication as a whole and you kind of position it, right, well, how do you consider God's pleasure to be earned? They argue through the publication, well, 43% of the publication, almost half of the publication, is based upon violence, warfare, conflict, killing, death, murder, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So the starting point, and this leads back into the militant faith proposition video, which is again available on our resource space. So really have a look at that, on how they consider their reality to be in this temporal realm. Their reality of any theological outcome is based on violence, is based on construct, the construct of violence. There isn't any other reality that can be perceived by individuals who support this particular ideology unless it's underpinned by the construct of military jihad. So the starting point is violent, and everything that emanates from it is violent, or not everything, but you know, the vast majority of action that emanates from it is violent. So Dabiq's focus is intrepid in the sense that it pushes individuals towards a very direct line of action, and that direct line of action is rooted in violence and conflict. And then you look at the caliphate, which no longer exists in the physical sense, but in the ideological sense it does, and arguably in the virtual sense perhaps it also does as well. But you've got things like hijrah, which means to migrate towards the caliphate, the preservation of the caliphate, allegiance to the caliphate, the territory and defending Islam and unity. All of these things are themes that they present within Dabiq as a means of attaining God's pleasure. And Dabiq in and of itself is a publication which speaks towards individuals in the here and now, but it has a reference point historically in the 7th century, but it's looking forward towards the end of time as well. So it's a real kind of unique construct in that sense, that an individual sitting in 2020 or 2014 when the publication came out, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017 up until 2018, when the publication was in publication, when it's being produced, when it was being written, it's positioning an individual to pull back to their historical roots perceived back in the 7th century, but also look forward towards the end of days. And the end of days meaning that you are the greatest people that are on the land at this moment in time, on the face of the earth at this moment in time, as per the prophetic narration. And we need you to come to this land of Dabiq in order to defend, either come to it either in the physical sense or in the literal sense in terms of your support, because there was a time where Daesh were advocating for people not to travel to the Islamic State for various reasons, and that's a separate conversation, but rather to send and lend their support to the self-proclaimed Islamic State. So you can begin to see how the eschatological focus of Dabiq, that's rooted in its name, that's rooted in eschatological theology, influences the way that they act, the way that they perceive, and how the underpinning of their faith construct supports the message that is pushed out to individuals towards a very particular course of action. And the interesting thing about Dabiq and the conversation that it has with the Romans, or Rome as it's referred to, is that it doesn't end just in that narration. Rather, the subsequent publication that came out after Dabiq was called Rumiya. Absolutely. So Rumiya is the name of those who associate themselves with Rome. And when you have a look at, and again, Rome being the broader context of understanding as what Rome or Christendom is considered to be. And Rumiya, when that was released, if you look at the data that's come out from European polls and statistical reports and situational reports in relation to terror attacks across Europe at the time that Dabiq ceased and Rumiya was released, attacks in Europe increased, and they have continued to increase. Just look at recently what's been happening across Europe. And this is a product of the continuation of Dabiq and the focus that Dabiq wants to have beyond the actual physical boundaries of Dabiq, rather spreading their perceived jihad across the world in order to establish the divinity of God. Wow. So what does that mean for individuals? What does that mean for folks that you may come across, that you may deal with? Well, what it means, and this is, I suppose, a combination of both the individual militant faith-based proposition and also understanding the embodiment of Dabiq, what it means, the eschatological narrations and the connotations that it has, and the point of actions that it's pushing individuals towards. What does it mean for the person that you may end up dealing with, the chap or the lady that's sitting in front of you? Well, it means that there's an individual who has an ideology that is rooted in conflict, that the embodiment of it starts from a position of conflict, from a position of warfare, from a position of fighting. And there are some behavioral characteristics that you'll be able to pull out from that. And if you look at some of the videos of individuals who are aligned to these groups, to these ideologies, to these causes, you'll see that there's a whole amount of judgment coming from that individual, that they are judgmental about anyone and everyone, including fellow Muslims, who don't support the view that they have. There's a hatred within their speech, there's an intolerance within their speech, there's an anger within their speech, and there's an inevitability within their worldview, that irrespective of what may happen to us, irrespective of what may happen to me as an individual, this is destined, this is foretold, this is prophetic, this will happen beyond anything that you folks can do to rebut it. These are some of the behavioral characteristics, and as mentioned in the other video that we uploaded, some of the contributing factors towards individuals being pulled into terrorism and radicalization, so absolutely are psychological, economic, political, there's self-esteem issues and all of those kind of things in the background. But within that as well, there are also individuals who have a referred to as an abhorrent understanding of theology and the theological construct, which is rooted in this particular understanding of faith. And that breeds these kinds of characteristics. It pushes out these kinds of attributes that are evident within the language and the behaviors of certain individuals. And those are some of the things that are really worth looking out for as you navigate your way through this, or what can only be described as a minefield of trying to safeguard the wider community from faith practitioners, faith and alleged terrorism and extremist actors, whilst also preserving the integrity of your actions amongst the communities that you desperately need the help of in order to deliver the counter-terrorism strategy contest, which is rooted and embedded within public trust and confidence. So folks, that's pretty much it from me. That was a short video just to talk about Dabiq, what Dabiq is, how relevant it is, what the influence of it is, and then it leads into a little bit about what's happening in Europe, across this world, across Europe at the moment. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop us an email at info@calmarina.com, or alternatively carry out checking our resource space at calmarina.com. Thank you very much.